Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to Cloud Wars Live. We're exploring the digital revolution and the incredible things that are happening in the world, especially all around this, the explosive field of data and the way that it has now become probably the most valuable raw material on earth. And we're delighted today to be able to speak with one of the top executives at DataStax. Ed Anuff is the Chief Product Officer, and he is going to explain some of what DataStax is doing to help customers become more data-driven, more responsive to markets, more successful. Ed, welcome to Cloud Wars Live. It's great to have you.
Great to have you here too.
So Ed, so much going on in this space. Tell us a little bit, please, about, the role that DataStax is playing right now and some of the big, challenges or requests you're getting from customers that are, helping to drive this evolution of your company.
Sure. So, I think that it's really interesting if we look at the changes that have happened in broadly just what people are doing with data, and more importantly, at least for us at DataStax, how people are building for data. So I think you've heard a lot of conversation about the power of data, how we are. The different approaches to it in terms of analytics, in terms of how we derive insights from it, how we use that to influence our engagement with customers. A lot of the technologies and mechanisms we do to do that, whether it is better analytics to help drive your business, or whether it's things like AI to actually change the way that you interpret and react to this data. But at least for where DataStax fits into the equation, it's really about how people build with data. Mm-hmm. In order for this to happen, in order for this transformation to happen, it doesn't just magically happen. This is in many cases not the data you already have, and in fact, I think this is one of the hard lessons that a lot of folks think and believe, because they start from a point where they're probably under the belief, and it's a mistaken belief, that they already have a ton of data. The reality is that getting into the level of data that you need to actually take advantage of a lot of these techniques and scenarios that you read about, you're actually talking about up-leveling it to volumes of data that your conventional infrastructure wouldn't even be able to handle. And so this is where the starting point for most folks is you start talking about saying, okay, you need to collect and log and interpret all of these streams of data. And then that's where very quickly the realization is that your application architectures, your data, and so on is just not, is not going to get you there. And so that's kind of this inflection point that a lot of folks have dealt with. There's a lot of other pieces that go along with that, which is that the natural consequence of this, both from a business driver in terms of building these type of applications, as well as from a technical driver, how do I do it, starts to drive thinking. If someone is not already well along their cloud journey, as they start to raise and bring these ideas front and center, they will very quickly start to realize that they need to accelerate their cloud journey.
Yeah. So Ed, it's all those challenges that you've just described there, they're significant enough in any case, but these days, right, at the pace of business, the way things are changing, every industry. So there's this notion of speed is great. The flexibility you're showing here with, guests who've entered the scene. But Ed, as I read up on DataStax, one of the things that it seems like DataStax is offering to customers is this ability to get a better fix on speed, flexibility, and innovation, right? The architecture that you've just described helps them to do that. And it really is one of those from-to shifts, right? Because the way they were set up in the past just would be incompatible with what they need in the future. So what role does DataStax play in that rapid evolution?
Well, so, where DataStax fits into the equation is giving you the infrastructure for dealing with scale out data. And what that means is that the first thing to keep in mind, and this is one of the things that I think goes back to what you talked about in terms of agility. So dealing with large amounts of data, and some people would debate me on this, but the reality is that there's been mechanisms, there's been means for many years to go and deal with large amounts of data. Certainly, even in the pre-internet age, if you had the data and you knew how much data you had, you certainly could go to your Oracle salesperson, write a very large check, and they'd set you up with some software that would handle that data. That's not what this is about. What this is about is knowing in advance, like, again, if you were to enter into that hypothetical, and unfortunately not a hypothetical for many Fortune 500 companies, they had to live this, but getting into that conversation required you to go and start to understand how much data, how is it going to grow over time? What's the upper bound on this? Because you would then have to get into a very serious negotiation with your software vendors, with your hardware vendors, a budgetary planning cycle that would involve your CIO and your CFO, and it was a very big deal. This is why when you would talk about the IT efforts back in in the 90s and the for many of the companies in the 2000s, before they started dealing with internet scale, and as they tried to address it, those were the problems. How much software do I need? How much hardware do I need? How do I scale that up? And business agility means going and saying, I don't know the answer to those things. We're trying to compete. If you are if you're dealing with digital transformation, it's because you've got born in cloud competitors that are coming after your business. And the way that you would do that, the way you would respond to that, was that you needed scale out infrastructure. And today, when we talk about scale out, we mean things like Kubernetes and certainly, if you turn back the clock, 10, 12, 13, 14 years ago, that was where the cloud started to arise, on the scene. That's where people started to first get really interested in what things like AWS were doing, was where you would go and say, look, my business requires me to deal with uncertainty around scale. I need flexibility, I need agility around it. And so that was where the cloud arose. That's where Cassandra, which is the database that DataStax is built upon, first made its name. So DataStax was the first and still is the most versatile scale out database, that for situations where your scale is going to go and grow in unpredictable ways. You hope it goes up, but that pace of where it goes up, what scale out means is I can just keep on adding nodes and servers and infrastructure that I don't have to go back to the drawing board. And so Cassandra was what enabled a number of retailers, many of the major retailers in operation today, built critical parts of their e-commerce stack on top of Cassandra. And so 10 years ago, in digital transformation, the question was, how do I compete with Amazon, right? If you think back to where many of the major retailers were dealing with this encroachment, they needed to have a scale out e-commerce stack. And so they were building on top of Cassandra, and they were leveraging the cloud to do that. Interesting and ironically enough, they were using AWS's cloud to hold AWS off. I remember having conversations with major retailers back in 2012, 2013, where they were very much doing that. So
it was the only alternative, right, Ed?
Well, I mean, there are multiple choices now, but I do recall talking to one executive at a major electronics retail store, big box retail store, that said, they were perfectly happy to let the fact that Amazon was subsidizing its cloud business with its retail profits help them accelerate and underwrite their digital transformation. Many of those retailers now, and this gets us into the multi-cloud era, have since moved on to other clouds. They do find that it's easier for them to align what they're trying to do with perhaps cloud providers that are not in their core business. That's one of the great things about multi-cloud. That's why we currently have a big three triumvirate of hyperscale clouds and a number of other cloud providers that are serving very specific use cases.
So, Ed, along with that, and again, I think it's so interesting when you're talking about this. It's a whole change in, as you said, not just one technology out, another technology in, but as you described that, the old world, right? You had to somehow plan, guess, predict into the future. I'll need this much, and then I'll buy this much software. So on the one hand, you had the pressure to say, well, tamp that down, right? Keep it as low as possible, which then limits your ability to deal with these new sort of situations, new levels of data and so forth like that. So companies were in some ways boxing themselves in, which then affected their business models, affected their planning and everything they did. So it just seems in today's times that was 100 years ago, but it wasn't that long ago. So a lot of this has happened really fast. And Ed, talk about, please, the role of the open data stack, which I think is so vital for what DataStax is doing. And particularly because I think every tech vendor you talk to today, I think they're in a race to see how many times they can use the word open in here. So what is it uniquely with DataStax that allows you to have that credibility about the open data stack?
Well, so I think that the interesting thing about data has been, with a few exceptions, I'm proud to say that Cassandra has really dealt with Scaleout technology better than the majority of them. I think that's what gives us a unique position here. But the reality is, all of the big data infrastructure, no matter how you define it, has been slow to leverage the cloud. And by slow to leverage the cloud, I mean that it's been very much, the challenge has been, and the cloud providers have done a good job of adapting to it. But if to the needs of data infrastructure, but most data infrastructure, most databases, and I include all of the big names, even the big open source names, were designed for this idea of dedicated hardware. If you were to go and talk to folks, if you were to go and talk to database architects, database administrators, and they would say, oh, you should use bare metal. And that's at odds with these agility requirements. And so a big part of what we've seen has been, the major catalyst for success has been, this move to this idea that you could separate compute and storage, and that you could do things like serverless data. Right now, if you look at, for example, a lot of people have been, very excited about the growth of Snowflake, for example. Well, what Snowflake did for the data warehouse was, again, that they brought this idea that you could have elasticity, that you could have growth without having to go and spend 6 months doing a sizing exercise. And once you erase that from the equation, then you just are focusing on the benefits that it brings to you. Well, in operational data, which is the type of data that Cassandra does, that most of what you hear from application use cases of data, that has not caught up as well with this elastic scalability of the cloud. So you're hearing a lot more conversation about serverless. This is one of the things that we introduced with our cloud service. So for the first time, Cassandra always had this ability to scale, but what we did was actually just make it completely transparent in the background, and really just told customers, you can just think about how many reads and writes are you doing. without having to actually do any sort of scaling exercise. And you're seeing a lot of folks following suit on this. I think that over the next 2 years, you're going to see that all forms of data infrastructure are going to be, in some form serverless, or they're really going to fall behind. This is going to be what developers and operators and IT are looking for in their data infrastructure. The open data stack is about how do we take this idea, how do we standardize it, how do we make it portable? And so what we've done, and again, I think this is early for most database providers, but what we've gone and done has been to go and base this on top of Kubernetes, base this on top of things like object storage that now has transformed how people go and organize their storage, whether it's in cloud or on-prem, because what you basically have is that the world is standardized around block storage, object storage, whether they're doing it on-prem with things like Minio, whether they're doing it in any of the hyperscale clouds. Everybody has S3 compatible APIs. And so you've got your storage now that is just, scale out via very simple APIs. You've got your compute now that's been standardized on top of Kubernetes. We're standardizing the API tier, things like REST, GraphQL, gRPC, service mesh, so that the networking and connectivity is standardized. And now within that, things like your database, things like your streaming infrastructure can all sit within that and be scaled in a very agile way. So again, that's what the open data stack is about. It's about going and saying there's an architectural transformation that's happening that all of your data infrastructure is going to become part of.
So, Ed, I wanted to be sure too to ask you about something you just mentioned there with developers, but also then to ask about customers. So, you had mentioned about for a long time that, IT organizations and developers were looking for something with more flexibility, more capability and so forth, but, it had just for some time been elusive. But now it seems like, the developers, maybe people in the development community would say we've always been rock stars, but I think the rest of us, the rest of the world is really recognizing that over the last couple of years. And you see these predictions for, the role that developers will play. It's pretty remarkable. So DataStax seems to have some interesting ways too to help developers specifically be more productive, be more successful, and be higher value in the organization. Tell us about that.
So, I think that the interesting thing is, it's a good observation, but I think that what's really important is that where the magic happens is that when you're removing the barriers to your developers from being able to go and deliver on these initiatives, as quickly as possible without having to go and interrupt every decision with a more, onerous, procurement process, budgeting process, and so on. Look, it's yes, we've got great developers and developers are recognized as rock stars and so on, but from an organizational standpoint, I often look at this and what does this translate if you're, from an enterprise standpoint? What it just means is that the time to experiment with an idea, the time to take something into production, the time to be able to respond to business changes, market demands, just gets reduced. Because the reality is, and the difference, I was at Google for a number of years, and we had great engineers there. Obviously, Google prides itself in hiring great software developers. But part of the way that Google actually does what it does is by creating the systems and automating those systems that make it possible for those developers on a day-to-day basis to not have to go and spend their time sitting around going and planning for doing capacity planning, for going and having to evaluate and negotiate with vendors and all of that. The developers come in. What the majority of developers at a company like Google spend their day doing is the same thing. Apart from those things, once you remove all of these things, the code that they write, the applications that they build, look just like what a developer at a Fortune 500 company would be building, in 2021. Yes, they're building web apps. They're invoking microservices. They're reading and writing data from databases. They're doing, all of these things are, the developer. The work that the developer does in developing, if you are running your company the right way, ends up looking a lot the same. What your difference between, if you're at a Fortune 500 company, if you're a CIO, what I assure you that the day of your developers looks significantly different is that you guaranteed or have a lot more overhead on your decision-making process. And a lot of that comes from a lot of cost controls and planning processes that arise from the fact that you're not building on top of a nimble infrastructure, that the cost of these decisions, of making the right or wrong decision, is so high that you've burdened your developers with processes. So it isn't. So yes, you may have some rock stars, but the majority of code written, even at these internet companies, is written by good developers. And I guarantee you've got good developers. You're just not giving them the ability to do what they need to do. You've got, many companies are still dealing with, as hard as it is to believe, the time to get a new database provision for when they want to try something out is days or weeks. Even in the days of cloud and cloud compute, I still hear from folks at major Fortune 500 companies that provisioning a new VM still requires them filling out a form. All of these things that you put in place, when you trace them back, they are because you have you basically have fragile infrastructure. You don't have agile infrastructure, and that transition is what makes all the difference. And so the open data stack is, the good news has been that the world of compute has caught up, and so now you can go and you can get from VMware, you can get from IBM, you can get even within your on-prem, your self-managed, you can get Kubernetes, and it's turnkey and all of that, but your data infrastructure is not caught up. And so the open data stack is about trying to make data catch up to where Kubernetes is, in terms of giving you that agility.
No, that's great. Fragile infrastructure to agile infrastructure. And so speaking of rock stars, right? If you hire a big band to come play at a party, and then you tell them, oh, by the way, you have to set up the stage, you have to put up the chairs, you got to do what's the point? They're not getting to exercise their art. They're doing things that they aren't contributing. So that I think your perspective on that was great. Ed, I wanted to ask you too about DataStax. Are there a couple of, you've described this a lot, but can you point to any particular things that customers have been asking you for to help them do things that they have not been able to do in the past?
Yeah, I think that the great thing, for what we've been seeing, over the last year. So when, about a year and a half ago, we went and took a look at the business. We said, okay, what's going on with the Cassandra, overall ecosystem, state of the software and all that. And what we found was that Cassandra had done a really good job of enabling scale, but it was hard to develop for, it was hard to operate, and it was expensive to run. And so we looked at those things. We looked at how to address those. We looked at changing the developer experience, making it API centric. We looked at the bringing it to the cloud, bringing it cloud native to Kubernetes, and we looked at things like serverless for changing cost. And once we did that, we started to to get a whole bunch of, so first thing was that was great. We got a lot of great feedback from that. But we started to then go and see, okay, being able to do this in a multi-cloud fashion is super important. We found that the interesting thing about multi-cloud is it's one of these things that people have been talking about for a long time, almost to the degree where you had sort of people coming at it from a contrarian standpoint, saying, does anybody really need multi-cloud? Isn't one cloud good enough for folks? Turns out that once you give people choice, that they would rather not have all their eggs in one basket. And so we started to get people saying, okay, we want to do things with Azure. We want to do things with Google Cloud. We want to have databases that can span all of those. We want to be able to leverage the availability of these. So bringing out capabilities like multi-region that bring the data as close as possible to where your users are, but also go and help you ensure that if something goes wrong, that there's a copy of the data so that your service is never down. Being able to go and have universal dial tone and whatever it is that you're providing to your customers is super important. So we see all those things. We also see now that people want to be able to go and connect this data to everything that they're doing. So streaming becomes really important as this universal glue for building a connected data architecture. And we see that as being a really important direction that a lot of customers are going in.
Well, Ed, this has been great. I think you've offered a wonderful view of what DataStax is doing, why it's making a difference here. And I wanted to see, give you the last word here. Is there anything you wanted to be sure to add?
Well, I think, we covered a lot of great topics. I think that things I would summarize again are that data needs to catch up with the agility that the cloud has brought. A lot of what the cloud has brought has been primarily around compute, making it easier to write software, to run your software, but data has been slow to catch up with that. And so the good news is that if you look at what DataStax is doing, frankly, and as to where all of the vendors that are thinking correctly about the future are going, they're thinking about that. They're thinking about multi-cloud. They're thinking about serverless. They're thinking about avoiding lock-in. They're thinking about being built on top of open source. I think that's the thing that I would leave people with, is that many companies are now, they're thinking about the next phase of their cloud transition. And what I would say is that as you do that, you don't need to be locked in. Any of the database alternatives that you're seeing, or data infrastructure alternatives you're seeing from a cloud provider, there are great third-party alternatives that are multi-cloud that won't lock you in. DataStax is one of those providers, but it doesn't matter what you're looking at. If you're looking at databases, whether you're looking at NoSQL, whether you're looking at SQL, whether you're looking at streaming, whether you're looking at data warehouses, there are first-class providers giving you that option, more often than not built on top of open source. I would heartily recommend that if you're a CTO, if you're an architect, if you're a developer, and if you're a CIO looking at the strategy across all of these, that you do your own homework, and that you look at these multi-cloud options, because having that optionality, avoiding lock-in, is going to pay a lot of dividends down the line.
Well, Ed, thank you so much, because I think especially your concluding point that we always say that in the cloud wars, the biggest winners are the customers, because they get to benefit from all this incredible innovation and the competition that's leading to that innovation. So I think those are wise words. Ed, thanks so much for being with us today. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
All right, and folks, thanks to all of you for being with us here at Cloud Wars Live. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation with the Chief Product Officer at DataStax, Ed Anuff, and we look forward to seeing you next time.